Welcome to another Polar Insight conversation where we speak with leading thinkers and practitioners to explore one simple question. How can we help leadership teams make decisions they can stand behind? Each conversation looks beyond headlines and conventional wisdom to uncover practical ideas that can help leaders navigate complexity, uncertainty, and accountability with greater confidence. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Sir John Curtice. While many people know John for his work on elections and polling, his career offers much broader lessons about interpreting evidence, understanding uncertainty, and making sound judgments when certainty is impossible. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Let's jump into it. Hello, welcome to another Polar Insight conversation. We're joined today by Sir John Curtice. Welcome to the show, John.
Nice to be with you.
And John, most people know you as Britain's leading pollster, and you've spent decades watching people interpret public opinion in lots of different ways. What do you feel like intelligent people get consistently wrong when they're looking at polling data?
The first thing that they get wrong is to say that I'm a pollster, because I'm not. I don't run opinion polls. I simply read the data. The only two forms of data collection I'm involved in. Well, one is very heavily British and Scottish social attitudes. They are run by the National Centre for Social Research. They're not exclusively or even particularly about politics. They're designed really to do two things. One is to measure the long-term changes in the climate of public opinion, and secondly, to be able to provide a platform to evaluate attitudes towards policy areas, particularly issues of public policy, issues of public controversy and debate, broadly speaking, in some considerable depth. The only other thing I do, which gets me closest to a pollster, is that I'm kind of the public face, but by no means the only person responsible for the exit poll that is undertaken at the time of UK general elections, with a view to trying to give a forecast in terms of seats of what the result of the general election is going to be just a few hours later on when the declarations have been made. Otherwise, yes, I've been involved a lot in the polling world because for more than 10 years or so, I was president of an institution called the British Polling Council. That is a body that enforces standards of transparency in the polling industry. It essentially it's the mechanism by which ensures these days that if any commercial pollster like YouGov or Ipsos or More in Common or whatever put out polling data, they are obliged to put out the underlying tables and also to give an indication of methodology, with a view so that anybody who has picked up some of this material can form a judgment as to whether or not they're inclined to believe it or not, and also what implications, if any, they might want to take away from it. So I think that's probably important just to state. What do people most often get wrong? Well, I suppose, one thing, of course, the most common failing with polling data is not taking account of confidence intervals, the fact that if you're doing a survey, however well conducted, however close gets to the nostrums of random probability sampling, it is always subject to sampling variation. So, do exactly the same survey, do two separate surveys on the same day, but same subject, ask the same questions, recruit people in the same way, etc., and you won't get exactly the same results twice. And to that extent, therefore, there's always a tendency to overinterpret small differences. So if a political party is up by 2 points, well, at least in any one individual poll, that is, well, maybe something's happened, but it could be no more than random variation. Of course, one of the difficulties is that very often public opinion, including voting intentions, doesn't necessarily change dramatically. It might only change by 2 or 3 points, which means, therefore, you actually sometimes have to get lots of opinion polls or repeated annual surveys that all show a consistent difference. And then you go, well, actually, the accumulation of the evidence is such that it seems reasonable to infer that a small change has taken place and it isn't just something else. But particularly, more popular interpretations, reporting of opinion poll and survey data do tend to sometimes overplay the significance of small differences.
And that idea that you mentioned there about accumulation of evidence over time, to the point at which you're then confident to make a decision around that, rather than perhaps making decisions, within two polls taken very closely to one another, or differences of a few percent. Can you talk through a little bit about, I suppose, in your world, how you think about that level of confidence at the point at which someone can make a decision on these things? I'm conscious that we're not always getting to a position of perfect certainty, but do you have any?
Indeed, and I think this is where there's perhaps a bit of a difference between those of us who are fully aware of and fully respect the nostrums of probability theory that say, you shouldn't overinterpret small differences. But who are also primarily interested in substantive change and substantive implications. And those who are very heavily steeped in statistical methodology and who will go P probability of this difference being significantly different is 0.06, and the conventional criterion is that it needs to be 0.05 or less. There's a 5% or less probability that the difference is something that could have simply arisen as a result of chance of sampling variation. The truth is that even if it is P equals 0.06 rather than P equals 0.04, it is more likely than not that things have changed. It's just that it doesn't meet this particular criteria. But sometimes people say, oh, well, nothing's changed. Well, actually, sure, we can't be sure, but you should be aware that maybe things have changed a bit. And of course, particularly, the extent to which something's statistically significant, yes, in part, it's a function of how much is the difference. It's also a function of sample size. And sometimes the reasons why you go, well, this is not significant. Well, of course, it's not significant because there just aren't enough people in this group. But it doesn't mean to say that nothing has happened, because it looks as though there's quite a big difference. And I guess what then also therefore matters is this. And I think, this is where marrying, as it were, an academic social science perspective with statistical theory becomes important. What you ideally do with any survey, any polling data, you go, so given what I know about the world, given what I know about academic theory, what do I expect? Do I think, for example, that as a result of there being a new prime minister, that I might expect there to be an improvement in the popularity of the incumbent party? Well, one of the things we can take as a guide there, for example, is past evidence. If in the past this has made a difference, albeit maybe not a great deal, well, that becomes a basis for expectation. And therefore, you may well be more inclined to accept, despite the uncertainty, strictly speaking, about the immediate evidence in front of you, that perhaps something is going on. If, on the other hand, you've got a difference which I can't explain this. This is completely unexpected. And even though I now know what the data say, and I'm going to attempt an ex post facto rationalization, I really can't think what's going on here. Then you have to say, well, maybe we should be doubtful. Now, let's just take one rather infamous example of this happening. So quite recently, there has been a controversy to which I've had some involvement about whether or not there's been something called the quiet revival, which is the notion that there has been a reversal of the decline in attendance at Christian church services in the UK in recent years. And the basis of this was work was done for the Bible Society for YouGov, which found that basically, whereas if I remember rightly, in 2018, roughly 5% of the population was attending a Christian service once a week or more, that number had gone up to 7%. And there were other indicators pointing in the same direction. And in particular, this was a change that seems going on amongst younger people. And of course, what we know is that there's been a long-term secular decline in attendance at Christian services in the UK. We've become much more of a secular society. But this very much got picked up again, because you get another rule of journalism, right? One of the other crucial rules of journalism is the exceptional, it gets headlines, the unexceptional and the boring and that nothing has changed here doesn't make it to the front page and doesn't create clickbait. Now, this was an exercise that was done honestly by YouGov, the Bible Society for whom it was done, interpreted recently. But some of us kind of went, well, this is a wee bit surprising, particularly in the wake of the pandemic, where we knew from other data, such as the Church of England's own data on attendance, that attendance at Church of England churches was still lower, been something of a recovery, but was still lower than it was before the pandemic. Now, it so happened that British Social Attitudes, which I've already indicated I'm involved in, has been collecting data every year since 1983 about whether or not people attend any kind of religious service, not just Christian. And so I was particularly interested in whether or not what has been the impact of the pandemic, not just on the Christian churches, but also on other religions. But because of this controversy that was going on and had been challenged by some, I was also using that as a peg for what I was writing. And basically, our data, which is collected using a different methodology from YouGov, it is much closer to random probability. And no, basically, yes, there's been some recovery since the pandemic, but actually attendance is still lower than it was before the pandemic. And there's nothing in these data to suggest that the long-term decline in religious attendance has in any way been reversed. Well, eventually, just a few months ago now, in the wake of this controversy, YouGov went back over their data and decided that they had been a victim of people basically claiming not to be who they are. And in particular, because what YouGov are doing is they're at the high end of the business, but that they're not recruiting people at random. They're recruiting people, getting people to sign up and say, yes, I'll do your surveys, et cetera, et cetera. And they do it for money. And one of the potential risks for that, and it's something that, other companies have said has become more of a risk, particularly in the world of AI, is of people claiming to be relatively rare kinds of people who are therefore more likely to be invited to fill in a survey. And therefore, and being a young person who attends church now lies in the litany of relatively rare groups. So YouGov have now said, actually, we think our data won't valid, and they're going to redo the exercise. But the point was, and I looked at the YouGov's data. What the Bible Society reported was fine. It was what it said. It was even more peculiar because if you actually looked at people's sense of identification as opposed to their sense of how often they attend, the YouGov data and the BSA data looked very, very similar. Okay, but it was just, I cannot explain why all of a sudden they've got this data. And as I said, in the end, we discovered as well. I know, as I have said on more than one occasion in public, and these things do happen sometimes. Sometimes you get data, comes back from the data process and you go, hang on, there's something funny here. We need to check this out. Maybe something's gone wrong with the coding. Have some people been accidentally missed off from being asked the question who should have been asked the question? And these mistakes do happen because all questionnaires these designed today are the result of computer programming. But that's a very, very clear example of where you actually need to apply the lens of past experience, past evidence, theory. What's your understanding about the character of the world to decide whether or not actually a change is something that you can believe, or whether it's something about which you need to be deeply skeptical. And of course, for churches which are facing a quite substantial challenge as to how they maintain themselves, particularly the Church of England in England and the Church of Scotland north of the border, getting accurate data on these things and what do you believe? And are we really reconnecting with younger people? Why might this be or not? And indeed also understanding the reasons why people, and the fact in the end of the day, and it's not just the Christian churches, but actually I think one of the conclusions I've now reached is that it's true of all religions, even though those attending the mosque, whose level of attendance tended historically to be much higher than people who identify as Christian, even they have been quite badly hit by the impact of the pandemic. Now we know that of course raises important questions. There was a controversy at the time about whether or not stopping people from attending religious services was or was not a reasonable part of the lockdown, as it was for a while. We're still debating more broadly what has been the impact of the lockdown on one person-to-person social interaction. So understanding all this is important because, one of the things we undoubtedly need to do, even though we can't be quite sure what kind of pandemic will hit us next and what the risks might be. And of course, this was a different pandemic from the one that policymakers had anticipated. All those uncertainties still be with us, but learning the lessons of, well, what are the costs of lockdown for a society is important. It's therefore this is one little part of that much broader story about which we're going to take, because of course a pandemic is a classic occasion when policymakers have to make decisions in an era of deep uncertainty. Yet these are decisions that are potentially existential for society and not least for people's lives.
And with with that level of, I suppose, intuition that I'm hearing that you're leaning towards.
It's more than intuition, James. It's not just intuition. It's not just I think X. It is that there is either well-developed theory that says, given how the world is developing, this might well happen. So there's plenty of again, take a field closer to what I normally spend most of my time doing. There is plenty of theory out there to explain why the link between social class and voting behavior may have weakened over time, and why other considerations such as education in people's age may have become more important. So and that's to do with to cut a long story short, to do with some of the consequences of the process of globalization. So people have developed theoretical arguments about the way in which the world is changing and are saying as a result of this is what we think, this is what's happening now. This then needs to be tested. But it's not dissimilar to theoretical physics, right? There's lots of theoretical physics out there about what we think must be true given the observations we've had and what we know. It refers to the whole idea that there's dark matter out there. Nobody's still found it, but we think it's there. In the case of the Higgs boson, we did eventually find it, right? And that was the result of scientific endeavor that was the basis of theoretical developments given observations we already have. And the same process matters to the interpretation of polling data, survey data, indeed, frankly, all kinds of statistical data, because at the end of the day, all statistical data is an artifact of human compilation. And although the particular risks that are involved differ, all administrative processes, come with their flaws and their gaps in terms of the information that they give you.
And I'm hearing a point of view that is very much it's very much informed by the work that you've been involved in over the last few decades, and to some extent, I would say a really deep understanding of kind of the scientific method, gathering evidence, creating hypotheses, etc., etc. As a leader in a large organization, in an enterprise who maybe doesn't have that type of background, I suppose, hasn't come from a research point of view, an academic point of view, a polling point of view.
Sure.
What do you think about the balance there? So when I mentioned intuition earlier, I suppose I'm coming from the point of view of, you may have experienced a scenario, experienced an environment that gives you a pretty good, a pretty good perspective on when, let's say, something is wrong and when maybe perhaps something needs testing. Is there a particular, approach that people can take, a particular way of thinking through scenarios that would help them when they spot these things which are a little bit off, or should they go for the data first and then match that up against their intuition? Should they go the other way around?
You have to. I think the obvious point is that no leader can be expert across the range of material that about which they're having to make decisions. I mean, even if you are very au fait with the processes and the costs and the personnel of the organization you are running, that doesn't mean you necessarily are particularly au fait with understanding what's going on in the external world, which is potentially going to affect the external market, and indeed what are not more effective ways of producing material or services or whatever it is you're involved in, than the practices in which you are currently engaged. So even if you understand your own firm or organization well, that doesn't necessarily equip you to understand the external world. The answer always has to be is you have to develop the art of what I will call the intelligent layperson. Right? This might sometimes associate as being the opposite of the scientific approach to things. Right? This is the person who has a range of skills, but who, above all, is willing and able to use their intellect to be able to ask questions. All right. And if at least you've got some understanding of the scientific process of how data is collected, it can be so. Sometimes you need to ask, how did you collect these data? What are the known limitations about these sources? And in other words, in particular, I guess two things. You've got to talk to those who do have the expertise in the areas that you don't have, but B, also create a culture in which you allow them to express their uncertainty and to allow you and allow them potentially to challenge what they think you might be inclined to do. Above all, what leaders need to know above all is the bad news first, the difficult news first. Yes, they then need to be able to challenge it. Say, well, hang on, why do you say this? But what about X, whatever? But the point is to have an environment in which it is clear you are willing to have, even if you're coming with presuppositions, for those presuppositions to be challenged, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's a brilliant book, I mean, it's now many, many years old, called by an American political scientist called Dick Neustadt, called Presidential Power. And the crucial thing that it said was, what good leaders are able to do, good political leaders are, and this is the same with people in industry and whatever, are the people who allow others to challenge them and to ensure that the things that they might be uncomfortable with are the things that they come with, and that therefore, and at the end of the day, they know what are the real uncertainties they are dealing with. The last thing you want as a leader is what you see in a Donald Trump cabinet meeting, at which everybody around the room says, it's all going fine, it's all going great, there are no uncertainties, and you as the leader doesn't go, but hang on, isn't this going wrong here? Isn't this going wrong here or going wrong there? All right. So that's to do with culture, environment, etc. And then at the end of the day, it's about being able to ask questions about areas you're not au fait with. You won't always manage to ask the right question, but if you have created that culture, it is more likely that your questions will elicit the information about the uncertainty and the scale of the uncertainty, and whether or not it's an uncertainty you can reasonably expect to live with, etc., etc. Right?
Mm.
That's that is, I think, above all. But of course, at the same time, again, I guess it's the other lesson from recent political history. You need to be able to do that, but at the same time, in the end, to have the confidence to make a decision on the basis of the best evidence available. And the best, you will never know for sure. And that in creating that environment of challenge, what you do there, on the other hand, need to avoid is creating a climate of chaos. And shall we say, there is one previous prime minister who is very well known for, yes, operating on the basis of getting different people to think different things, but that was always potentially, that reached a stage where it was dysfunctional rather than functional and advantageous.
Mm. Where you were mentioning just then the creating the culture and creating the environment to be able to create challenge, essentially. One of the things I was thinking through when you were talking there is, obviously earlier on we were discussing about the media and the fact that they potentially go for exceptions to the rule because it creates a news item. Similarly, though, you could argue that, and I know this isn't a conversation about journalism, but you could argue that the journalism sector and in the media in general, by the very nature that they're there to question, perhaps they almost by accident create the culture of questioning data, questioning inferences in results from polling, for example, which perhaps then again creates the condition for the truth to surface somewhat. So they're bringing together perhaps some evidence, perhaps some opinion.
To a degree, James, but they also get caught. They also sometimes get caught up by conventional wisdom. So it's very, very difficult to persuade many journalists that just because economic growth has gone up, it doesn't necessarily mean that the government is going to become more popular. It might create the circumstances in which governments might be able to improve their popularity, but it's not inevitable. And sometimes clouds hang over governments that mean that irrespective of their record in office, they cannot recover. Not least, particularly if they've suffered some catastrophic political event, such as a financial market crisis. Very, very difficult for governments to recover from that. But sometimes, and one of the things that I slightly delight in is, let's challenge the conventional wisdom. Hang on, you say this, but what? Right? And remember, in particular, there are often narratives out there. So one of the narratives that's going on at the moment is that Andy Burnham has demonstrated a particular appeal to reach out to working class, pro-Leave, ex-Labour voters who'd switched to Reform. He's had some success in that, but actually it looks pretty clear that he's had rather more success in reaching out to discontented Labour voters who switched to the Greens. Now, but you are therefore to some degree challenging the conventional wisdom, and certainly some of us spent an awful long time challenging the conventional wisdom that Labour's victory in 2024 was some miraculous landslide that reflected the fact that people had regained confidence in the Labour Party because Keir Starmer in particular, because he had changed the Labour Party. So I was like, no. The evidence doesn't prove this. And we kept on gradually chipping away, and eventually 2 years later, or equally, again, going back to a previous Labour government, the new Labour government of 1997 came into office saying that we will keep to the spending targets of the previous regime, even though Ken Clarke, the outgoing Ken Chancellor, said, "There's no way I would have kept to those spending." It was they were fiction, but they did, and because Labour believed that people were were not going to be willing, if there was any semblance of the idea that the Labour government was going to increase taxes. Well, eventually, 2 years into office, the penny dropped, not because British social attitudes had kept on saying, you know what, people are more concerned about the state of the public services, the long waits for health care, the state of the schools, particularly in London, and if anything, they're willing to pay more taxes for that. I mean, I had Labour ministers say in public, I know what British social attitudes say. I think they are wrong. And some of us had gone back and reanalyzed the 1992 election, which is where they got this all from, and said, no, you're misunderstanding what happened in the 1992 election. But this became a conventional wisdom. And eventually, you know, but of course, it was what Labour MPs heard in their surgeries that eventually convinced them that they need to change tack, and eventually Labour turned on the spending taps. They increased taxation, albeit they did it through national insurance rather than income tax, etc., etc. Journalists sometimes, and certainly because politicians are in the game of creating narrative, and all leaders are. Again, this is a warning to leaders. All leaders are in the game of creating a narrative about their organisation to try to give their employees or whoever they're working with, their customers, a sense of direction, that this is an organization that's going everywhere. And that, of course, is a crucial aspect of leadership. But do not necessarily be willing to challenge the myths that you are telling about yourself. Because if you start believing the myths you tell about yourself, when actually they are not adequately rooted in reality, you will fail to realize what your weaknesses are potentially before it's too late, which certainly in Keir Starmer's case certainly proved to be the case.
And do you feel like, have you got any particular examples for yourself throughout your career where you have been, particularly convinced there's going to be an outcome, something, whether in politics or otherwise? Has there been moments where you've thought this is absolutely going to happen, and then things have gone a completely different direction? Do you feel like over time that you've improved your judgment around that? Have you got any kind of advice or thoughts on?
James, if the world did occasionally surprise you, it would be a boring old place to be in, right? So, just very, very immediately, the day that Nigel Farage announced he was standing down and refighting Clacton because of the allegations surrounding both his and his party's finances, I wrote a piece for the Telegraph, said, well, not obvious this is going to go very far, because so far, at least, all the various allegations that have surrounded Farage have not seemingly had any impact on his personal popularity. What happens? Lo and behold, perhaps because Farage himself gave all of this air support for Farage's evaluations and support for reform very, very clearly take an immediate knock, right? So, yeah, sure. I mean, all you can do is say, this is the position so far. Doesn't look as though it's had much impact so far. And you always end up saying we have to wait and see. But sure, these things don't necessarily happen. Did I necessarily anticipate that reform were going to rise in support in the last 9 months of the last Parliament? Not necessarily, no. You could see why it was happening once it started happening, but it's not something you could necessarily forecast. But sometimes you get it right. I did write very much after the 2024 election, look, if the Labour government doesn't manage to turn around the economy and the health service pretty fast, given the how in which the reputation of the Conservative government, Conservative Party has been trashed by its perceived record between 2019 and 2024, the future of the two-party system is up for grabs, and that's very, very clearly what happened. But sometimes you will anticipate correctly on the basis of the evidence you've seen before you, but sometimes not. And certainly at the moment, one of the things I keep on saying, given British politics is an historically unprecedented situation, don't rely on history to tell you what's going to happen next, because it doesn't provide you with a provide you with a good guide. You've got to look at the contemporary evidence and try to make sense of that if you're going to understand what's happening. But yeah, sure, of course. That's why I don't claim to be a forecaster, and I'm always very, very reluctant to make a forecast. I'm often will be willing to say, if X, then perhaps Y. And I will often be willing to say, well, given that party A is trying to achieve X, then strategy B rather than strategy C seems to be more likely to be an effective way of achieving its objective. Yeah, that's the kind of thing that I would do. And that's partly a question of putting yourself in the shoes of those who are having to make decisions and saying, well, if I were in their shoes and I were trying to achieve their objectives, which I'm not necessarily particularly in favor of, then this seems to me what seems to be the more sensible thing to do. So, sure, doing that kind of thing, yes, but
Absolutely.
Forecasting, very, very, be careful.
I think it goes to we have a guest coming on the show coming up, and in our conversation there was some discussion around structured empathy and this idea of, as you say, putting yourself in other people's shoes in a very consistent way. And I think, to link it back to what you were saying about narratives within organizations and narratives that need to be created, I think the focus that needs to be made on saying, for example, I think this could be the case and therefore we should do X, rather than I think this is the case and therefore we should do X. Sometimes those small changes in language, in the context of building a really strong narrative inside a business, can result in completely different results, essentially, or completely different outcomes. And I think this is something we see. Well, you see it not only in politics, but you see it within kind of corporate cultures as well, where someone may be saying something. If someone says something in a particularly direct way, if they're not putting in place the kind of nuanced language that perhaps they should around the evidence that's supporting the statement they're making, very often the people hearing those messages just go, okay, well, that's absolute fact, what that person's saying, or there must be a lot of evidence to back that up. And I think that, that difference between the two is something where, certainly in our work, where people either operate in a culture of gathering evidence and making judgments based on that evidence, or they operate in cultures which are kind of the opposite of that. Often you can almost hear the difference in the conversations you're having with them in terms of how they interpret data, how they interpret evidence, and how they build statements and communicate with one another. I don't know whether that's something you found in your work as well.
I mean, sure, but again, I suppose 2 points to make here. I mean, one is there is arguably a difference between the culture within the boardroom and the culture as a communicator. So within the boardroom, you want the nuanced conversation. You want people to be willing and able to take on board the uncertainty and eventually, hopefully, come to a majority, if not indeed a consensual decision about, given the uncertainty, given what we know and what we think we know, this seems the best decision. You then, however, do want, having made that decision, you want your organization to make the best fist at implementing it. So at that stage, you might want to use a rather tougher language in giving the sense of direction than you might have wanted to have in the decision-making forum or fora. So I think I would draw a distinction there. And certainly I'm very well aware. And again, this becomes much easier. I mean, if you're writing, 600 words for a newspaper, you don't always have time to go into the detail of the nuance. I'm always much more comfortable, however, if even if I kind of can only kind of put in a bit of a caveat and say, well, on balance, it seems as though this is the case or whatever, even if I don't have the space to put well, what are the considerations in one direction and what are the considerations in the other direction? But if I've either, at least for myself, gone through all of that, or if, actually what I'm summarizing is a much longer academic argument, and I know I've been through the pros and the cons, and it's out there for somebody who wishes to go through it. But so again, where you are trying to distill something for people so that they can understand more quickly, relatively quickly, as it were, what are thought to be the headlines, you're writing in a different mode than you are, classic academic work where, the uncertainty should be, where possible, always fully declared, while still having some kind of narrative story that persuades people that what you're writing about is worth reading about in the first place.
And if we take this, I'm going to kind of send us back to. I read that you were born in Redruth and grew up in St Austell. I spent a lot of my childhood in Portreath. We used to go there a lot when I was a kid.
Well, you're lucky you had the North Coast, didn't you? Yes.
Exactly, just down the road from Redruth there.
Yeah.
So that point of view that you made just now, and that perspective, what do you think it was about growing up in Cornwall in that environment? I know that you had, I think your mum was a market researcher, is that right?
Yeah.
Is there something from growing up in that environment, whether that was geographically or in that period of time, that you feel has slightly informed how you think about these things now? Do you look at communication differently? Do you think about the role of gathering evidence, research, academia? Do you feel like there's a thread that's come from those years to what you're doing now?
There are some threads. My mother, by the way, was also a local politician, so I saw some of the political game as well. Trying to provide leadership, etc., etc. I guess the story you need to know is again rather different, which is that I was always a bit of an anorak about these things. So I first got interested in elections in particular, and therefore more broadly politics, at the age of 9. My first political memory was the death of Hugh Gateskill in 1963, the subsequent election of Howard Wilson as leader, and then not long thereafter, the resignation of Harold Macmillan and the replacement by Sir Douglas Hume, which I can remember my then school teacher, who also came on after retirement to become a local councillor, talking about that. So there was a bit of politics kicking around, right? But what grabbed me was the electoral process, right? And I started reading books about elections and voting behaviour as a teenager, James. So, sorry, it's a bit sad, but that's probably... So, yes, I had some understanding what my mother was doing, though not much of the broader process. And I did kind of a little bit later on myself as a student. But it's really rather more realizing that there was a way of studying politics and particularly voting behavior in a relatively dispassionate fashion. And then that just as gradually morphed into a broader interest in public opinion, public attitudes, social change, social attitudes, etc., etc. So it's not particularly Cornish, I don't think, other than perhaps a breath of fresh air occasionally. There's a little bit in my familial background, but it's not a lot. And I always say to people at the end of the day, I can't really explain it. It's just something that happened to grab me.
And as we wrap up today, one thing which our listeners and people around our organisation and around Polar Insight conversations, a lot of them often ask us for practical approaches to bring some of this into their day to day, and either people, organisations, communities that they can engage with to be able to improve how they think about some of the topics that we've been speaking about today. Do you think there is any communities, people, organizations, etc., that perhaps people wouldn't think to turn to when it comes to some of the questions that we've been speaking about, but perhaps they should? Who do people not speak to enough in this context?
Well, you probably know the answer to that question better than I do, but I would simply say that the world of evidence has never been more plentiful. Indeed, it's arguably one of the challenges of leadership now is that, there is more evidence than you can potentially accumulate. But given that is the case, once you have reached any reasonable size as a company, having some at least minimal ability to employ people who do actually read research, it may be economic research, do with social trends, whatever is potentially relevant to you. I mean, either employing directly or at least employing, research organizations. There are plenty of think tanks out there, plenty of consultancy organizations who will do this and who have on their staff people who, they are potentially jack of all trades research-wise. They're not necessarily always experts in a particular area, but they are experts in accumulating, gathering, and assessing evidence because they've got those generic skills of inquiry and search, etc., etc. I think I would say anybody running an organization needs to say, am I and my organization learning, and do I have an infrastructure to make sure that we are keeping up to date? And it's either done in-house if you've got big enough, but certainly occasional out-house. And maybe occasionally spending a wee bit of money on what seems an extortionate amount of money for somebody to go away and find out some facts and give you some interpretation of them. But maybe actually sometimes it might be money well spent. After all, we are living in a world of very substantial social, geopolitical, and technical change. So putting your head in the sand and assuming the world's going to carry on as it is doesn't strike me as a very sensible approach to running anything these days.
And with that, I think we will wrap up today's conversation. Thank you very much for your time, John. It was great to chat with you, and we'll see each other soon.
I try. Not at all.